Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. This past Friday, I think it was, Alexei Navalny, a key opposition leader in Russia, was announced that he had passed away, had died in a penal colony in Siberia. And this has sort of taken over the airways in the course of the last couple of days. Big protests in Russia and big controversies as to what different people around the world, different leaders have to say, or frankly, in the case of some, not say anything. And so I wanted to reach out to an expert in Eastern European issues. Marcus Kolga is his name. He is a writer, communication strategist, a human rights and disinformation expert. I know him from working with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, but I think he's got numerous other functions as well. To talk a little about it. And he actually doesn't have personal direct experience, but has some sort of business experience with one of Alexei Navalny's organizations. So I think that, Marcus, you can shed a lot of light, both with your expertise and your personal connection, on what's going on. So tell me, Marcus, number one, welcome to the show. Number two, tell me, what was your reaction on Friday when you heard the news?
Well, thanks again for having me on, Brian. This isn't the first time this has happened. And because I've been working with the Russian opposition now for the past 10, 15 years or so, various different pro-democracy activists, anti-corruption activists, this is a scenario that's been playing out really going back to 2006, assassinations, murders of opposition leaders, critics, journalists in Russia. And, every time it happens, that flicker of light, that hope for Russia that's democratic, free and transparent, respects the rule of law and human rights, that flicker gets a little bit dimmer. And certainly on Friday morning, when I got the news from a Canadian parliamentarian, was the first news that I saw when I woke up, looked at my phone, and it happened again. And you get this, especially when these people, the people in the opposition, these activists, you've interacted with them, many, family members of many of them. There's an understanding of what they're going through, and there was a terrible feeling in the pit of my stomach when I heard the news. You hope it's not true. But sure enough, it seems now that Vladimir Putin, we know now, it's been confirmed by Navalny's people as well, that he was indeed killed by the regime, whether directly or indirectly through 3 months or 3 years of incarceration, much of it in solitary confinement. It's entirely possible that he was murdered on Thursday. There's an autopsy that's happening right now, but I would suggest that it's not quite an autopsy, but probably a laundering process where they will probably try to mark any traces of whether it's violence or poison or God knows what was used to kill him. So that remains to be seen, but he is now gone. And, it's a big blow to the Russian opposition. It's hard to see how they're going to be moving forward after this significant blow.
Tell me a little bit about Alexei Navalny, if you could.
Navalny is was a U.S. educated opposition figure. He really rose to prominence in around, the late 2000s, around 2010, 2011, when he started analyzing and exposing corrupt Russian oligarchs, corporations, and members of the regime. He did a lot of this not using traditional media, because already back then the Kremlin was turning the screws on independent media in Russia. So he was using emerging platforms, primarily YouTube, to get his message out. He was used his own online blog, which became extremely popular, especially among younger Russians who were sick and tired, quite frankly, of the growing autocracy, the dictatorship that Putin was setting up. And so, through that work of exposing corruption, he started amassing a huge following. And so at around 2011, 2012, he joined other major Russian opposition leaders in Russia, like Boris Nemtsov, who was probably the leading opposition figure at the time. And in 2012, he was one of the lead organizers of probably the largest protests in Russia against the Putin regime. And we really haven't seen those sorts of protests like we saw in 2012. That's when the big crackdown from the regime happened on the opposition, and so Navalny continued that work uh, over the past decade, exposing Vladimir Putin's own corruption, the wealth that he has amassed, the billions of dollars in wealth, the mansions that he has all over Russia. And so this was extremely irksome, obviously, to the Putin regime, um, as is any criticism, as we see now. And they did all that they could to try and silence him, recognizing the fact that he was and continues to be extremely popular in Russia. And so that's in there were a number of frivolous cases that were brought against him, various fraud cases and such, which were all sort of dismissed by the European Court on Human Rights. And of course, in August of 2020, they tried to poison him. And this is being investigated by a very well-known international open source intelligence investigative organization called Bellingcat. When they investigated the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, they found that Russian authorities were tracking him and were responsible for his poisoning. He managed to escape within a hair of his life, or within a hair. That poisoning. Luckily, he was transported to Germany, where he eventually recovered from that attempt on his life and returned to Russia in January of 2021, where he was immediately arrested, thrown into prison. There were massive protests. Thousands of people were arrested for protesting Navalny's arrest. And for the past 3 years, he's been incarcerated, primarily in solitary confinement, and most recently in this godforsaken remote prison where he eventually died on Friday.
I want to come back to the poisoning and that 2020-21 situation in a couple of minutes if we could. But right after he returned to Russia, I understand he released a video about this mansion on the Black Sea that Putin has that got over 1 million views or something like this. And am I correct in saying it was a $2 billion mansion?
Yeah, I mean it's a pretty outrageous structure there. I mean, I think it has an indoor skating rink and an indoor private casino. It's a massive, massive complex. And yeah, you're right. I mean, he released this right after he was arrested. The video itself got millions of views. And I think it remains today the most popular YouTube video ever in Russia. So it's those sorts of very clever tactics. And Navalny always had a knack. It wasn't just, dry facts. He always injected humor into these videos, and that's really what made him and his work so popular among Russians. And like I said, I mean, he remains popular to this day. Like you said, there was these massive protests after he was arrested in 2021 when he returned, but and the response to his death was a bit more muted this time around, but that's due to the very violent and aggressive repression of the regime. So yeah, those videos remain popular, and the work that he did do to expose that corruption wealth is extremely important today.
He was a lawyer, I understand, and tell me a little bit about him as a politician. My sense is he was incredibly charismatic and articulate, both in Russian and later on reasonably well in English, and funny was my sense of him. How would you describe him as a politician?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Like I said, I mean, all of his work, his anti-corruption work, all the YouTube videos that he put out, the publications he put out, he did this in a way that was entertaining, and again, he used humor very effectively, and I think that's why he was as popular as he was. And he was primarily a politician. That's how he identified himself. He was crusading for a free and democratic and transparent Russia. And like I said earlier, I mean, he started doing this already in the sort of the late 2000s. And he, because of that work, he became incredibly popular amongst Russians. Now, it's worth noting that in around 2006, 2007, Navalny was associated with Russian nationalists, and so there is a bit of a darkness to his past as well, which is often noted by I think a lot of Ukrainian activists, certainly minority groups within Russia. That his past is complicated, but I think that he certainly changed, I think, in the, around 2011, 2012, became much more of a liberal Democrat. And like I said, once he made that change, his popularity amongst Russians really, really did grow. And this was, I think this is one reason why he is now dead, is because of that immense popularity that he had amongst Russians. That represented a significant threat to the Putin regime, because Vladimir Putin himself is not particularly popular amongst Russians. He's been in power for 24 years. He's failed to deliver in any meaningful way on reforming Russia, on improving the living standards for average Russians. I'm not talking about those living in St. Petersburg or Moscow and major urban centers, but throughout Russia. I mean, he's just been his 20 years have been a failure, and so I think that Navalny was, again, very effective in speaking to those average Russians, and had he been allowed to continue his work, if there were democratic elections in Russia, I suspect that Navalny would have risen to prominence and probably would have challenged Vladimir Putin credibly for the presidency of his country. But that's not the case. He's now dead.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with Marcus Kolga talking about Alexei Navalny, his death, the impact that he had on Russia, and will he have a continued impact? Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Alexei Navalny, who was the major opposition figure in Russia, imprisoned in a penal colony in Siberia, was killed, murdered potentially on Thursday, Friday of last week. And so Marcus Kolga, who is from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, a very well-educated, knowledgeable, articulate gentleman on what's going on in Eastern Europe and other places in regards to misinformation and things like this, is someone that I've had the pleasure of speaking with before. And so I thought I'd reach out to him to find out what he thought about what's going on. Marcus, let's go through some of the things you mentioned, if I could. So that, there was this film, Navalny, that I think won an Academy Award that addressed this issue about his nationalistic right-wing connection. And he tried to explain it, that you mentioned, and he tried to explain it by saying that he really was trying to bring together all the groups that were in opposition to Putin and the existing establishment. And it had to be, he didn't use this language, I don't think, but it had to be a big tent, because he had to get everyone that was in opposition collectively to get together to oppose. And that he didn't support those issues. And he was confronted by the filmmaker, I guess, about, how could you associate with people that had that attitude? And he says, because I was trying to bring together the opposition. How do you think he addressed that? Was it adequate?
Well, I understand what he was trying to get at. It was really critical. Certainly, if we go back to 2012, when Putin had sort of stepped back to become prime minister, handed over the reins of power to his friend Dmitry Medvedev, and there's the term limits, the legislate or the constitution had been changed at that point. He was running again. What was really required was a coalition of opposition groups. And it wasn't just Alexei Navalny, but it was true liberals who were involved in this effort to bring all opposition groups together to try and really pose a meaningful challenge to Vladimir Putin. And, people like Garry Kasparov, Boris Nemtsov, Vladimir Kara-Murza, Ilya Yashin, all of the major sort of players in the opposition were involved in this, and they bought into it, and they agreed with Navalny that this was the way to move forward. Now, do I 100% buy Navalny's explanation? I'm not so sure. I think in 2006, he may have had some tendencies, whether that was simply political opportunism, or whether he was a genuine believer in some of those nationalist ideologies. I'm not entirely sure, but I think that that should not overshadow the contributions that he made to our understanding of the kleptocratic nature of the Putin regime, his contributions in helping his fellow Russians understand the nature of the regime, and his advancing of core democratic values in his country. I think we need to focus on that aspect of Navalny's work, of his life, and also to make sure that that legacy is not forgotten, not amongst, people in the West, but certainly amongst the growing number of Russians who are now living in exile because they cannot live in such a repressive state, and also inside of Russia. And we need to do all that we can to make sure that we preserve that memory, again, that legacy, and help advance that cause in Russia. I think that's what we need to focus on instead of Navalny's more complicated youth and early days in politics.
Let's talk a little bit about this poisoning, because you said that they attempted to poison him. They actually, from at least what I can tell from the movie and other reports, they did poison him. It just that it didn't take, they didn't have him in the air long enough to have it had the desired impact. At least that's the sense that I get, is that what happened is that he was poisoned when he was on this trip to Siberia. They were on a plane to fly back to Moscow. He got sick. The plane was diverted. And he was rushed to a hospital en route. And it would almost appear from the movie, at least, that if the plane hadn't been diverted, if the pilot hadn't diverted the plane on an emergency landing to rush him to hospital, he would have died on that trip. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, that's clearly what would have happened. Novichok, this is a nerve agent that is works aggressively on the human nervous system, and indeed, it was just by chance and the Navalny's luck that the pilot of that airplane did the right thing to divert it to that hospital. Had they not diverted at that moment, had Navalny not received treatment immediately, it's likely he would have died on that aircraft. And that does indeed seem to be was what does seem to have been the intent of the regime to kill him there. Like I said, Bellingcat did an investigation, and it appears that FSB agents, the FSB is of course a successor organization to the KGB, the Soviet KGB, which I think all your listeners will remember. FSB agents had been tracking him already for years. An assassination squad that was well known, that had been identified already in relation to the Skripal poisoning. It was a similar situation in London, where a critic of the Putin regime was living in exile in London, was also poisoned. There was an attempt to kill him with the same poison, Novichok. It failed. Instead, the FSB agents killed a UK citizen, a civilian, accidentally. But that same group had been tracking Navalny for, like I said, years, months in advance. And there was clear evidence that those FSB agents, after they had placed the Novichok, they placed it in the sort of the crotch of Navalny's underwear when he was outside of the hotel at a rally event. They had entered the hotel, placed this into his underwear, and then left. And so that was the source of the poisoning. And once the poison had taken effect, he was already on the aircraft. Bellingcat found that those same agents returned to the hotel basically, or while he was at the rally, in fact, returned to the hotel to clean things up and remove all traces of the poison. And so, we know that that the regime was behind it. Getting back to the aircraft and the actual act of the poisoning, I think it's thanks to Navalny's wife, who very loudly advocated on behalf of her husband when he had been removed from the aircraft, taken to the hospital. She insisted that the regime transport him to a Western country, because she obviously didn't trust the care that he would receive, for good reason, in that hospital. luckily, the German government and a hospital in Berlin responded to those calls and offered to fly Alexei to Berlin to receive proper care. The local authorities relented. A private aircraft landed in Omsk and took him to Berlin. And thankfully, I think it's that entire series of events. The fact that the pilot decided to divert, do the right thing, that the doctors in Omsk actually gave him the care that he needed, and the fact that the German government had sent an airplane to pull him out and take him to that hospital, the Charité hospital in Berlin. For all of those steps resulted in his surviving that poisoning. I think that had any of those steps been delayed in any sort of way, he probably wouldn't have survived. And we should also remember that that's not the first time the regime has tried to poison a critic of the regime. I mentioned the Skripal poisoning, but Vladimir Kara-Murza, who happens to be a very good friend of mine, also a leading opposition leader in Russia, he was poisoned in 2015 with the same substance, Novichok. He also barely survived. There was a considerable advocacy by his friends, myself included, Bill Browder, to ensure that, or to send a signal to the regime that we were, the Western world was paying attention to this. He barely survived that poisoning. They tried again in 2017 with Vladimir Kara-Murza. Again, he barely survived that. And in 2022, in April of 2022, he was arrested in Moscow after he had gone on CNN to criticize the Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And he's remained incarcerated ever since. He was given a sentence last year to 25 years. And he's been like Navalny, Kara-Murza has been in solitary confinement for the past 4 months and will continue in solitary confinement for the foreseeable future. So, there are other Russian opposition leaders who are very much in the same situation, and their lives are also at risk right now as we speak.
In the movie Navalny that won the Academy Award, they actually, I think, connect up with one of the assassins on the telephone, which I thought was unbelievable. And the individual, assuming it was accurate that it was actually the assassin on the other line of the telephone, really admitted to the whole scheme. Was that person ever found?
Well, I mean, they found him on the phone, but the regime would have protected him. The regime would have protected anyone that was involved with his poisoning, as they do with all other, assassins and such. And I know that the scene that you're talking about. I mean, it's interesting in Russia, because of the level of corruption, it works sort of both ways. So investigators who have a little bit of who have resources can actually buy databases of various different telephone numbers. They can buy data, including, digital, voicemails, that sort of a thing. And that's how those investigators, Bellingcat and Navalny's own people, were able to get that information about those agents that were involved in the assassination. And it's a great scene. I mean, I think that's one of the best scenes in that movie where, as you say, I mean, Navalny himself calls up his own assassins, the would-be assassins, and confronts them. And so, there's no chance that those assassins, those responsible for that poisoning, will ever be brought to justice under the current Russian administration. Like I said, they'll be protected. The only way of receiving any sort of justice or accountability will be outside of Russia right now. But like those assassins will never, they will never be held to account outside of Russia because of that protection that they enjoy from the regime.
Marcus, Alexei Navalny, during his recuperation, was living a good life in Germany. Why did he return to Russia?
Well, I've asked the same question about Vladimir Kara-Murza, who also was living in exile, poisoned twice, returned to Russia. These are people like Alexei Navalny, like Vladimir Kara-Murza, like Ilya Yashin and others. These are people who are deeply committed to bringing democracy, justice, human rights, the rule of law to their country. It's very difficult for them to do that, to achieve any of that uh, when they're living abroad, when they're living in the US, the UK, Germany. And so they felt, because of that commitment, that they needed to return. They needed to, the only place where they could really fight for those values, for those principles, was inside of Russia. And even though they knew the consequences, they both knew the consequences. Navalny knew that he was going to get arrested when he returned. He needed to do that. Otherwise, he wasn't doing his job. Like I said, he identified first and foremost as a politician, as a leader for his people, to bring democracy to, who was dedicated to bringing democracy to his people. And that's primarily the reason why he returned. We also know that, you know, Russians appreciate those leaders who suffer. They can identify with that suffering. And so I think that was, I'm not sure that necessarily motivated Alexei Navalny, but that certainly, I think that held true. I mean, we can see from the reaction in January 2021, the Russian people's reaction to his arrest, the tens of thousands of people who took to the streets. You know, I remember watching those protests. It was, you know, out in the far east of Russia, temperatures were as low as, you know, minus 50 degrees. There was what they call ice fog in Russia, where the air is literally frozen. You know, thousands of people took to the streets in remote cities and towns across Russia. And so, you know, I think Navalny knew that was the reaction his arrest would get and he hoped it would motivate his people to stand up for themselves, to have that courage, to demand better, to demand democracy and respect for the people of Russia. You know, again, I think he achieved that momentarily. I'm not sure. I mean, the repression of the regime has been so severe, so violent, so aggressive over the past 2 years that, you know, I'm not sure that the Russian people, while Vladimir Putin is in power, will ever live up to the hopes that Alexei Navalny had for them. But again, I think it's, you know, if we can help the Russian opposition movement, you know, retain that legacy, ensure that Russians do remember his work, his commitment, and his efforts. You know, I think that the flicker of hope that he represented will hopefully remain alive.
Well, I guess that's really, you know, the most important question. You know, I think there is a big question about how he died and who was responsible, and I think that'll either is being answered or at least people will come to the conclusion that it was the Russian regime that was responsible. But the more important question, I think, is will this opposition effort die with Alexei Navalny, or will he be a martyr that is the catalyst for a renewal of that opposition effort? Let's take a break, and when we come back, ask Marcus Kolga about what he thinks the future for any opposition in Russia is, given what's happened. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Marcus Kolga. He is an expert on Eastern European politics, security, what's going on in the war in Ukraine. He's a misinformation expert globally. He's from Estonia, and he's therefore very knowledgeable intimately in what's going on in the Baltic and some of the concerns there. And Marcus, I think you've got some personal connection with the corruption efforts, or at least the anti-corruption efforts in Russia that maybe we'll touch on later. But let me go back to this question that we just touched on, if we could. You know, some people, when they die, become a martyr that actually is a positive catalyst to change. And other people, I think, when they die, their efforts die. What's your sense of what's going to happen in Russia in regards to the impact of Alexei Navalny on the opposition in Russia?
Well, It's hard to say. I mentioned earlier that I've been working with Russian opposition leaders, human rights activists, anti-corruption activists for the past 15 years. Um, the situation in all of those years, and say even the past 24 years that Vladimir Putin has been in power, the situation for the opposition and democracy in Russia has never been so grim. Um, the the opposition that was, I would say thriving in 2011 and 2012. There was a real hope that they might make an impact. Most of those individuals are either in prison, dead, assassinated, or living in exile. And so their presence in Russia right now is extremely limited. Vladimir Putin has completely censored, blocked off, eliminated free expression. There is no more free media that is available in Russia. There are limited there is some limited news that's getting into Russia via Telegram and YouTube, but I would say 95% of news has been completely taken under the control of the regime. And so under those sorts of circumstances, it's very hard for anyone in the opposition to communicate with average Russians, to speak to them. And so, the situation, like I said, is quite grim. And I was just in last May, I was in Vilnius for what's called the Free Russia Forum. It's basically a gathering of all of the Russian opposition leaders, independent media, and such. And I didn't get any sense that there were any new ideas about how to advance these issues, these democracy, human rights inside of Russia. I spoke to one gentleman who was a member of the opposition, and he suggested that the change in Russia, I think everyone was expecting it to happen democratically, but that I think there's a shift happening in the opposition right now, where there's an understanding that if there is a change in Russia, it will have to come likely violently, the way that it did in the last Russian revolution, and in 1991 as well. There was a certain degree of violent change. It came suddenly and it came violently. It's likely that change now will come in much the same way. And so I think that the opposition, at least the exiled opposition, is sort of steeling themselves for that moment. They are quietly working and preparing for that window of opportunity. And we saw that in June of last year, when Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner mercenary group, nearly marched on the Kremlin. So, we've seen that possibility. It could happen. It almost happened in June. And if the opposition works together, if they have the resources, if they can find the resources to do it, that is probably the way that this regime will end, with bloodshed. Unfortunately, it may not initially end with a democratic leader. It could be somebody from the inside that takes over, but there is, I think, the opportunity for a democratic change in Russia passed long ago, and we should be prepared, if there is a change, for it to be violent.
Just out of interest, do you know what has happened to the Wagner Group? Has it been taken over by the Russian army, by Putin, or is it still in existence?
Well, in the days after the failed coup, we know that Prigozhin dismantled large parts of it, including the information operations that he was engaging in. The elements that were operating in Africa, and that was primarily Russia's presence in Africa, was primarily through the Wagner Group. The Russian Defense Ministry has taken over those elements of Wagner. So, I mean, it's been that entire organization has been largely dismantled now and has been taken over by the government.
Marcus, I think it's incredibly, I'm not sure if ironic is the right word, but it's interesting that at the same time as we've had this news about Alexei Navalny, we are faced with a situation in the United States where funding for the the Ukrainian army for Ukraine in its fight against the invasion of Ukraine from Russia is stalled in the Congress, in the House of Representatives, and the Speaker has, called a 2-week holiday. And I compare the courage that Alexei Navalny showed by going back to Russia and standing up and going to prison, knowing that he was going to go back to prison more than likely, versus what we don't see in regards to leadership and just the desire for power and doing whatever it takes to keep power, rather than doing sort of what I would describe as the right thing. What do you think, if any, is the impact of Alexei Navalny's death on the politics of funding of Ukraine in the United States?
I've seen, all sorts of tweets and people talking about this over the past few days. I'm not sure that it'll have all that much impact. I think that what we're seeing in the US is a minority group of extremists who have taken over the GOP's policy positions. I'm not sure that they're going to be their views, their positions are going to be impacted by any of this. I think they've drank the Kool-Aid. They're opposed. They simply opposed to any support for Ukraine at this point. They seem to be aligned with many of Vladimir Putin's Christian nationalist points, whether it's anti-LGBTQ positions, views about Ukraine being a corrupt neo-Nazi state, and so I'm not sure that they'll look to Navalny as any sort of beacon of hope or of as a champion of democracy and freedom, which they should be. Their understanding should be based on that, but it's not. So I'm not very optimistic that this will have any sort of impact on U.S. politics or the far right anywhere, including here in Canada, which also shares those same views that that minority group in the GOP does.
So I think that you're right in regards to the minority group, but they're not in control. The moderates and the Speaker in the House of Representatives could call for a vote, and everyone that I've spoken with or listened to says that if the vote is called for, they'll win. The problem is that the Speaker will then face being deposed, and so again, the Speaker and some of the people that are in the moderate position in the Republican Party, even though they know what's the right thing to do, I think, are more interested in keeping power than they are in saving Ukraine.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, partisan politics is being given priority over doing the right thing. My sense is that we're seeing a little bit of that trickle up into Canada as well, especially these votes on the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Act, which were extremely disappointing. I think the conservative justification for voting against that it's not very clear. I think what is more clear is that it is based on partisan politics, pushing back against the government, and that sort of a position is, I think most Canadians, moderate Canadians, understand that, and it's deeply unfortunate. And I hope that sort of thing ends in this country. But in the U.S., I'm not sure that I suspect that the Speaker will triumph ultimately. Maybe there will be some form of compromise. I thought that this latest compromise in the Senate, where we do have very rational people on both sides of the Senate, I thought that might have had a chance of breaking through in the House. Clearly, it has not. So, maybe things will change. Maybe let's hope that the House will find some compromise and vote through this package, because as you mentioned, Ukraine needs this. They're running out of artillery. We saw that the fall of Avdiivka over the weekend. Russia is making advances on other fronts in Ukraine because of that lack of ammunition and specifically artillery, and so they desperately need that help. And I think that those on the far right of the GOP need to recognize that, first of all, I mean, these are not traditionally conservative positions they're taking. Reagan is clearly, rolling over in his grave, or would be rolling over in his grave if he saw what was happening. and that the costs of not helping Ukraine achieve victory will be much greater down the road. Hopefully they'll realize that, but it doesn't seem like they seem far more interested in engaging in partisan politics right now than helping Ukraine.
Marcus, did you watch the Tucker Carlson interview of Putin, and if so, any reaction?
Yeah, I did watch it last week. I mean, it was embarrassing for Tucker Carlson. I mean, he was really, I mean, rolled over by Putin. He gave Putin an opportunity to, again, he gave him an international platform through which to promote his conspiracies, grievances, and justify his invasion of Ukraine using, the same narratives that he's been using all along. And, going back to, those positions that the minority far right in the GOP have taken. I mean, I think it bolstered those. I mean, it added fuel to all of that. And so, I don't think it had much of an impact on, centrists in the Western world, but I think it further emboldened the far right. I mean, it was just it was Putin himself. I mean, it was an hour and a half, first hour of it was just a rambling justifications, historical justifications for his invasion, and the rest of it was just an attack on the Western world. Yeah, I mean, it was a shame that it happened at all, and it was embarrassing watching Tucker Carlson engage in that sort of an interview with Putin.
I can't believe that people still support the man after that interview. I can't believe it. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back with Marcus Kolga for some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm chatting tonight with Marcus Kolga. He is an expert on what's going on in Eastern Europe, and he's got some personal connections with the anti-corruption efforts of Alexei Navalny. He has dealt with and knows a lot of the opposition leaders in Russia, and he's knowledgeable on politics and what's going on from a military standpoint throughout the world. And so he's someone that I have relied upon to become educated on some of these topics in the past. And I really appreciate it, Marcus. One more issue in the United States before we come back to Alexei, if I could. A week ago, Donald Trump, former president of the United States, current leading candidate to become president, again, said something to the effect of that he's warned a NATO leader that if they don't fund up to the 2% of GDP amount, he'll encourage Putin to do whatever he wants in regards to that country. What do you think the impact of that kind of a comment is on your country of Estonia or other people in the Baltics or other people in NATO?
Well, I mean, Estonia shouldn't be too concerned because they're spending well over their 2% GDP of defense, GDP on defense. In fact, I think they exceed 2% of GDP funding just on the effort to support Ukraine alone. So when Donald Trump said that, I don't think that he was looking directly at Estonia, but he may have been looking at a country like Canada. In Canada, we're only spending 1.3% of our GDP on defense. That's well below the 2% mark, and it makes us really a sort of a bottom. We're at the bottom of the barrel, with regards to defense funding. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that the world recognizes Donald Trump as being a bit of a blowhard. These are the kinds of things he says, and during his first administration, luckily we had some very reasonable, wise people, basically acting as guardrails to his foreign policy. Will that, assuming that he wins again, will he have those same sorts of people around him? We don't know. But I think that we need to some degree take him for his word. I mean, he said before that he'd want to pull the U.S. out of NATO. And again, suggesting that he would almost invite Russia to attack those countries that aren't meeting their spending requirements on defense. I think that should Donald Trump win, I mean, NATO is going to be much weaker. I think that we will see a retreat of a U.S. retreat from NATO, from other sort of important foreign policy hotspots and issues and such. And I think the Western world, including Canada, needs to prepare themselves for that. So that means Canada, we need to boost our spending. We need to, number one, meet our NATO commitments of 2% funding, but we also need to make sure that our borders are defended, and that means our collective borders, including NATO's as well.
Let's go back to Alexei Navalny. Marcus, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, how do you think Alexei Navalny will be remembered, and will he have had an impact on Russia?
Yeah, he definitely had an impact on Russia. I think that if democracy actually manages to prevail in Russia, he will be remembered for all of his work. But like I said earlier, I mean, it's sort of incumbent on us as well to help preserve some of that legacy. And one of the things that my friend and colleague Bill Browder has been calling for is, for example, in terms of accountability, one of the ways that we can hold Putin to account is by ensuring that Ukraine wins in this war. And so what he's been calling for most recently is taking the $300 billion that the Western world has seized in Russian reserves throughout the Western world, and ensuring that the Europeans, the Americans, and Canadians pass legislation. We could call it the Navalny Act, that would allow our governments to take that $300 billion in Russian funds and repurpose it to support Ukraine, to use it to help arm Ukraine. This is one way that we can ensure that legacy is that legacy is preserved, and that we honor his legacy. And we can continue doing other things, such as ensuring that those dissidents who remain alive in prison, like Vladimir Karamurza, that we protect them and ensure that the same fate does not befall them. We could even consider some sort of try to engage in a prisoner swap with Russia. Perhaps Julian Assange, trade him for Alexei. Or not for Alexei Navalny, but for Vladimir Karamurza, and ensure his safety that way. So there's a lot more that we could be doing, including supporting Russia's exiled opposition leaders, civil society, independent journalists. There's a lot that we can do to help preserve again Navalny's legacy, and to help the Russian opposition continue the work that Navalny was engaged in.
Marcus Cole, thanks so much for joining us and telling us about Alexei Navalny, his life, his legacy, the impact that you hope he has on democracy in Russia, and encouraging us in Canada to support Ukraine. Really appreciate it.
Anytime. Thanks for having me on, Brian.
That's our show for tonight. Thank you for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody. Thanks, Marcus.